Hello, sixth graders. Our lesson today is adding and subtracting mixed numbers. Our learning target you need to write down is I can add and subtract mixed numbers. Some vocab that we need to have written down here. Common denominator. This is a denominator that is the same in two or more fractions. If you do not know the lowest common denominator, multiply both of the denominators together. That's a key thing to make sure you have written down in your notes. Okay. An improper fraction is when the numerator is larger than the denominator. Example, 12 over 5, so 12/5. That's an improper fraction. Okay. Steps here for adding and subtracting mixed numbers that we need to have in our notes. Number 1, rewrite the fractions with the same common denominator. Add or subtract the numerators. Keep the denominator the same. If the fraction is an improper fraction, rewrite it, but don't forget to add to the whole number. Then you add the whole numbers and simplify. So steps 1 through 3 are just like we did in the last lesson. You're just adding the fraction parts. Then you add the whole numbers together and you combine them and then simplify your answer. Remember to use estimation to check to make sure that your answers make sense and to help you solve the problems. Okay, so here we are adding mixed numbers. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to estimate. So 7 4/9 is close to 7 1/2. 10 2/9 it's a lower fraction, so I'm going to just estimate it down to 10. If I add these together, that would be 17 1/2. So my answer should be somewhere around there. So now let's do the actual addition for this. So I've got 7 4/9 plus 10 2/9. So we already have like fractions. We have common denominators on there, so we can add the fractions together. So 4/9 plus 2/9 is 6/9. The next step is then to add the whole numbers. So 7 plus 10, which is 17. 6/9 would simplify. We can divide both of these by 3. So that would be 17 2/3. Which is pretty close to the 1/2 that we got when we estimated. So right there is my final answer. Okay, so some for you to try here. Pause and then come back and check your answers. So 6 1/8 plus 2 5/8. Again, we have a common denominator, so we are just going to add the fractions together. 1/8 plus 5/8 is 6/8. Then we add the whole numbers, 6 plus 2, which is 8. And then I need to simplify. So I know I can divide both of these by 2, which would be 8. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 8 divided by 2 is 4. That is now in simplest form. So my answer is 8 3/4. Which if I were to estimate these, 6 1/8 is close to 6. 2 5/8 is close to 2 1/2. 6 plus 2 is 8 plus 1/2, 6 1/2, 8 1/2 is pretty close to 8 3/4. 5 1/5 plus 2 3/10. Common denominator between these would be 10. So I'm going to rewrite the fraction. Multiplied this by 2, so I would have 5 2/10 plus 2 3/10. Add the whole numbers. 5 plus 2 is 7. 2/10 plus 3/10 is 5/10, which I know this can be divided by 5. So my answer would be 7 1/2. That's now in simplest form. 1 5/9 plus 4 1/6. Common denominator between 9 and 6 would be 18. So I'm going to multiply by 2. And if you don't know that, remember you can multiply them by each other. So you could do 9 times 6 and then 6 times 9, and you would end up with a common denominator. This side we're going to multiply by 3. So we will have 1 and 10/18 plus 4 and 3/18. Add the whole numbers. 1 plus 4 is 5. Add the fractions. 10/18 plus 3/18 is 13/18. That cannot be simplified, so that's my final answer. The biggest mistake that I see is people forgetting to add on the whole numbers, and they would just say that their answer is 13/18. So make sure that you remember to add your whole number and include it in your answer. Now we're looking at subtracting mixed numbers, same thing as before. So we follow the same steps as addition, but now we are subtracting. I'm going to estimate here. 8 and 5/6 is pretty close to 9. 2 and 1/3 is close to 2, so my answer should be somewhere around 7, give or take a little. So 8 and 5/6 minus 2 and 1/3. Common denominator between 3 and 6 is 6, so I'm going to multiply this side by 2 to get to 6. So I have 8 and 5/6 minus 2 and 2/6. Subtract the whole numbers. 8 minus 2 is 6. 5/6 minus 2/6 is 3/6, which can simplify to 6.5, which is close to the 7. Remember I said give or take a little because you are rounding up or down. So that answer does make sense based on my estimate. Same steps as addition. All right, quite a few here for you to try. Watch a couple if you're stuck, otherwise pause, try them on your own, and then come back and check. 5 and 4/5 minus 1 and 3/10. Common denominator would be 10, so I'm going to multiply by 2, which would be 5 and 8/10 minus 1 and 3/10. 5 minus 1 is 4. 8/10 minus 3/10 is 5/10, which I know can divide by 5, which would be 4.5. Check with an estimate for each of them. 13 and 7/8 minus 9 and 3/4. I can multiply again by 2 to get a common denominator of 8. So then I have 13 and 7/8 minus 9 and 6/8. 13 minus 9 is 4. 7/8 minus 6/8 is 1/8. That's in simplest form, so there's my final answer. 8 and 2/3 minus 2 and 1/2, common denominator of 6, so I multiply this side by 2, which would be 8 and 4/6. Multiply this side by 3, minus 2 and 3/6. 8 minus 2 is 6. 4/6 minus 3/6 is 1/6. Again, we subtract the numerators. 4 minus 3 is 1. Keep the denominator of 6. And that's in simplest form. 7 and 3/4 minus 4 and 1/3. Common denominator on here would be 12. So I would multiply by 3, multiply by 4. 7 and 9/12 minus 4 and 4/12. 7 minus 4 is 3. 9 minus 4 for the numerators is 5. Keep the denominator of 12. That can't be divided by anything other than 1, so that's in simplest form. 11 and 5/6 minus 3 and 1/8. Common denominator between 6 and 8, I know I could use 24. So I'm going to multiply by 4, multiply by 3, do the same things to the numerator. 11 and 20/24 minus 3 and 3/24. Notice the whole number doesn't change at all. I am just changing the fraction. 11 minus 3 is 8. 20/24 minus 3/24 would be 17/24. And that is in simplest form. Last one, 9 and 4/7 and 5 and 1/2. Common denominator, I can use 14. So I would multiply by 2, multiply by 7. 9 and 8/14. minus 5 and 7/14. 9 minus 5 is 4. 8/14 minus 7/14 is 1/14. And that's in simplest form. So I'm following the same steps as I did with addition, except that I am subtracting. Okay, so the next part that we have here is renaming mixed numbers to subtract. So this is what we do when we have a fraction out front that is smaller than the fraction we are subtracting from. So just like if we have 10 minus 8, we would regroup, stuff like that. It's kind of like that, but with fractions. So what we are going to do, we are going to take this 2 1/3. Well, first let's estimate it. So 2 1/3 is close to 2, minus 1 2/3 is close to 1 1/2. If we subtract those, that's equals 1/2. So my answer should be pretty close to 1/2. So 2 1/3, I am going to rename it. And what I'm going to do, so if I think about it, I have the 2, which is like a whole, 2 wholes, and then I have the 1/3. So I'm going to take this 2 and I'm going to make it 1 less. So I'm going to cross it out and I'm going to make it a 1. Now, the other 1 that I took away, I'm going to make into a fraction. And since I have it in thirds, I am going to make that fraction 3/3. So that is still equal to 1. This is equal to 1. So if I added those together, that would be the 2 out front. And then I still have that 1/3. Now I'm going to add this 3/3 and 1/3, which is 4/3. So it's going to be 1 and 4/3. And I'm subtracting 1 and 2/3. So again, I took the 2 out front. I took the 2 out front and I made it 1 less. I took that other 1 that I took away and I turned it into a fraction of thirds because my denominator is thirds. So 3/3, added on this 1/3 that I had to make it 4/3. Or in another term, I made the 2 1 less, and then since I was talking about thirds, I added 3 onto the 1. Now I can subtract like normal. 1 minus 1 is 0. 4/3 minus 2/3 is 2/3, which is a little bit more than a half, but that makes sense. So there's my final answer. So that's how we rename fractions. This just takes some practice. So if I was trying to take 8 minus 8 or 3 3/4, I don't have any fraction to subtract that 3/4 from. So I'm going to make this whole number 1 less, which would be 7. And then that 1 that I took away, I'm going to turn into a fraction of 4/4. 4/4 plus 7 is still equal to 8 because 4/4 is a whole. So then take that minus the 3 3/4. Well, 7 minus 3 is 4. 4/4 minus 3/4 is 1/4. So now let's do an estimate here and see if that is correct. Well, 8 minus 3 3/4 is pretty close to 4. 8 minus 4 is 4. My answer here is close to the estimate that I got, and it's in simplest form, so now I am done. All right, here are some for you to try on your own or follow along and copy them down and pause and try them on your own when you're comfortable. So 11 2/5 minus 2 3/5. Well, I can't take away 3/5 from 2/5. So I'm going to make the whole number 1 less, which is 10. And then I'm going to take that 1 that I just took off, and then since I'm in fifths, I'm going to make it into 5/5. And then I have to add on that 2/5 that I already had. So 10, 5/5 plus 2/5 is 7/5. Subtract the 2 3/5. 10 minus 2 is 8. 7/5 minus 3/5 is 4/5. That cannot be simplified, so there's my final answer. Next one, 5 3/8 minus 4 11/12. Well, the first thing I need to do is get a common denominator, which would be 24 for these two numbers. So I would have 5 and 9/24 minus 4 and 22/24. Well, I can't take 22/24 away from 9/24, so I have to regroup or rename. So I make the whole number 1 less, which is 4. I take the denominator, which is 24, and I'm going to add that onto the numerator. 9 plus 24 would be 33/24 minus the 4 and 22/24. 4 minus 4 is 0, so then I just subtract my fractions. 33 minus 22 would be 11/24, which is in simplest form. Again, if I estimated it, this would be 5.5 minus 5, which would be 1/2 as an estimate, and 11/24 is pretty close to 1/2, so yep, that does make sense. And the next one, 7 minus 1.5. Again, I don't have a fraction to subtract from, so I'm going to make the whole number 1 less. The one that I took away, I'm going to turn into a fraction. Since we are in halves, it would be 2 halves. So that's still equal to 1. 6 and 1 is 7. Minus the 1 and 1/2. 6 minus 1 is 5. 2 halves minus 1/2 is 1/2. Can't be simplified. Okay, so if you are stuck, please make sure to go back and rewatch the parts that you are confused on before coming to class tomorrow. If you are still stuck with other questions, make sure to ask those questions in class.